So you apply for a job and you get a rejection. No big deal. You think, I'll just apply for another job. Maybe someone else will give me a shot. So you apply for that job. Rejection. All right, 2 people said no to me. You apply to another one. Third rejection. And you keep going and going and going. And you just keep getting rejections. Now, you might think, I can't believe all these people don't like my resume or my application. What's going on here? But suppose that you find out it's not different people that are coming to the same conclusion about your application. It's the same AI algorithm in each and every instance. Because it rejected you the first time, it's going to reject you the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time, etc. This kind of scenario was raised by my guest today. Her name is Kathleen Creel. She's an assistant professor at Northeastern University, where she's cross-appointed between the Department of Philosophy and Religion on the one hand and the Corey College of Computer Science on the other. What Kathleen's particularly interested in is asking the question, what happens when a bunch of organizations choose the same AI algorithm when they're distributing goods or services, like hiring or admissions to college or lending money or generating medical diagnoses? Her answer, in short, of course, is that it's a bad thing. It's bad for the people who are systematically excluded from those opportunities, and it's bad for the organizations who would benefit from having those people included. Now, how do we solve this problem? It's complicated, of course, but the basic solution, so argues Kathleen, is that we need to introduce randomness into the AI system. And whether that's a good thing and how one would do that and who would do it are among the issues that we discuss. Now, does Kathleen call this, as I titled this episode, Tyranny of the One Best Algorithm? She does not, but she should, right? I mean, that's a pretty good title. Okay, as usual, I am your host, Reed Blackman. This is Ethical Machines. You can email me at em@reedblackman.com. And as usual, I beseech you, review the podcast, write a review, share it with your friends, do all the things that one is supposed to do. All right, that is it from me for now anyway. Let's go talk to Kathleen. So Kathleen, from what I understand, most of us are looking for, if we're in the AI world, we're looking for the best algorithm. We want to get the best algorithm for whatever it is that we're trying to do, hire people or interview people or, I don't know, assess mortgage applications or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I take it that you think that there's something or a number of things that are problematic about the search for the best algorithm. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic with the basic idea that if we have a choice between algorithms, we should pick the best one on whatever metric that is. Both as a computer scientist, that's what we're trained to do, we're trained to optimize. And then as a philosopher, there are lots of times where we think for epistemic rationality, in order to do the right things in terms of making the best decision we can on the basis of some kind of knowledge, yeah, we want to pick the best algorithm. But the problem that I want to introduce, and that some people in this field have been talking about recently, is what if everyone picks the same best algorithm?
So is this kind of a problem with, on an individual level, it's fine if you throw out your piece of plastic. That's fine. It's not a big deal. Instead of recycling it, but when no one's recycling it, or it's okay if an individual drives a car. The problem is when tens of millions or hundreds of millions, however many people are driving cars, then we have this collective problem. Is that the right analogy?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a problem of collective action where we might individually be making the best decision by our own lights, in the same way that, in some sense, it isn't individually rational to vote. We don't think that our individual vote will
Right.
change a difference in any kind of election most of the time. But collectively, it's important that we vote in order to
Yeah.
make the best decisions as a group. And this is an interesting variation on that, which is that if each individual person or company or group picks the individual best algorithm by their own lights, that makes perfect sense. It's rational. But it might be that if they all pick the same algorithm, then the same flaws in that algorithm, whatever they are, get consistently perpetrated across the ecosystem. And so we can no longer rely on what we rely on in human decision making, which is that we all make different mistakes.
Okay. Yeah. Bring this out for me because, suppose I said we all make individual decisions about what car to buy, let's say, and individually rational, blah, blah, blah. But if you say, what if everyone drove a Honda Accord? I'd be like, all right, then everyone will drive a Honda Accord. No big deal. So why is it a problem with AI if we all make the same decision? If all these companies, individuals, etc., choose the same algorithm, what's the downside to that?
Yeah, that's right. I think you're right. If everyone drove the same Honda Accord, that wouldn't be a problem, in part because cars are standardized to meet certain federal safety standards. But with algorithms, a lot of the algorithms that we think about in the AI fairness space are in the game, in the business of distributing opportunities, like opportunities to get loans or opportunities to interview at companies. So if you have the same algorithmic screening tool across many companies, let's say the same algorithmic screening tool is used at 60% of the Fortune 500 companies, and that screening tool, to speak metaphorically, doesn't like you or isn't able to see the good in your application, then you just won't have an
Yeah.
opportunity in a consistent way.
So let's say it's applying for a job. I apply to all these Fortune 500 companies. They're all using the same algorithm. If the algorithm doesn't like me, as you say, I'm going to get shut out not just out of one job, but out of many. It'd be less likely for that to happen if we just have human decision makers, human hiring managers, because there's so much variance in how humans make decisions that one person doesn't like my application, but another person may very well like it. Okay, that's a problem. So I guess we're getting to this issue where people are systematically shut out from opportunities. Is that okay? Yeah, that sucks. Is it also bad for the companies themselves?
Yeah. So for the companies themselves, it's bad because they might overlook people who would be great employees or who would bring something different to the company than the type of candidates that they're currently able to find with the algorithmic screening methods. And when I first got into this line of work, I thought, oh, because it's bad for the companies, they would have an incentive to fix it. But what some of my labor economist friends pointed out is look, if there's this very small group of people who's not being correctly algorithmically assessed, but because of this homogeneity across the decision making sector, that your competitors also can't find
Yeah.
those people, then it's not actually a competitive disadvantage to you. It might be a net total disadvantage, but you're not losing out to competitors who also can't find those people.
All right. So then I guess, well, one question then is there actually any motive for those companies to change their behaviors? And if so, what would that look like? I take it it'd have to be introducing some kind of variance, but you don't want to introduce worse algorithms. I take it that, yeah, is that the solution? Introduce worse algorithms? It seems like a way of getting a variance, but also decreasing accuracy, which is not desirable.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there are a few ways to look at this problem. So one is if the reason that companies currently aren't incentivized to find these people, just to continue the example of hiring, is that there's some informational cost to finding the people who currently aren't being found. And you would have to, let's say, gather more information or something like that. Then we might have to incentivize that through some sort of regulation, which we can get back to later. But it could also be that it's not that we actually have to go out and gather more information. It could be the scenario that we just happen to be using the same models from the same company.
Hmm.
And there's a real opportunity because for every model that you have that has a certain accuracy level, let's say 63%,
Hmm.
it turns out there's this phenomenon called model multiplicity, which means that there are lots of other models that have the same
Hmm.
accuracy and just make slightly different token decision points. And so
Okay.
you could find those models for a similar cost and just randomize between them.
Oh, I see. Okay. So I guess one point then to say is that there isn't the best algorithm. It's not the problem that we're searching for the best algorithm then. It's the problem is that the model that was chosen is deployed by the same company. And so it's not we're on the search for the best algorithm. It's that there's the one that was chosen by the company that's really good at marketing and sales. And so they've got tons of traction with the Fortune 500. So then I would think then does that mean that the point of attack, so to speak, for that try to solve the problem is not the companies themselves, but it's the solution providers, it's the builders of it? Or is it yeah, I guess that's my question.
Yeah, I think we could approach it from either of the two directions that you indicated. So it could be let's work with the software as a service providers of these algorithms who the companies are contracting with, and let's encourage them to find more of these models in this sort of cloud of possible models with similar accuracy, which we sometimes call the Rashomon set. So let's search within that set of similar models to find different models. And the same company that we have been working with can now provide us a bunch of different models that have these same properties, and we can use different ones on different hiring cycles. But we could also instead say maybe the problem is that there's some kind of more old fashioned monopoly in this
Yeah.
sector, or too many companies are working with the same providers. And so we need more competition and diversity in the model provider space.
Oh, that's interesting. It's a like sort of a monopoly issue.
Yeah, because companies like HireVue have been explicitly pursuing the strategy of doing roll ups, which means buying lots of smaller companies. And so they
Ah.
have been consolidating market power in a much more traditional monopolistic sense.
Oh, here's a first pass at a thought. That sucks to be them. Are they being wronged? I think that it seems like a bad situation for them. And one thing that I try to think about in all these kinds of cases, that there's harm here. Are they being wronged though? Are they being treated unfairly or unjustly? I mean, they don't have a right to an interview if that's, or they don't have a right to a loan or a right to a whatever it is. My initial instinct is to say that sucks for them, but they're not being wronged. And to whom would they offer a justified complaint of being mistreated?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and such a good, keen philosopher's question, because we could say they're clearly being harmed.
Yeah.
Something bad has happened to them. But are they being wronged? Has some kind of unfairness been perpetrated on them, as you said? I think we can think about this in a couple different ways. I do think that they're being wronged. And I think that they're being wronged because of the essential arbitrariness of having chosen this one model instead of selecting more uniformly from this set of possible models. So there's just in the sense that you might have a complaint under, say, let's say like a contractualist framework. You might be able to say, hey, if we've all agreed to adopt some kind of a law or some kind of a policy. Of course, we didn't really get that much say in these algorithmic hiring systems, but let's say even in the best case, we all agreed to adopt this policy. But it turns out that it has an undue impact on one particular person. That person might be able to say, if I can propose a similar policy that doesn't have any greater impact on anyone else, but does reduce the impact on me, let's say by shifting all this burden that's been concentrated on me and spreading it out over more people, they are allowed to ask for that switch in a lot of contractualist ethics. And so the idea here would be if we've concentrated all the errors of algorithmic judgment on a small group of people, they should be allowed to request that those errors be spread out because it is unfair to them to concentrate those errors.
When you say they should be allowed to, they are allowed to. They could, one, there's a pragmatic issue. How the hell are they going to find each other? Because usually the discriminated groups that we talk about are the common ones. Member of a historically marginalized group, a member of the black population, Native American population, women. And so they can readily identify other members of their cohort who are potentially being discriminated against. You could bring lawsuits, class action lawsuits. But I take it that these algorithms, yeah, look, if they're discriminating systematically, let's say against black women, we might be able to figure that out. They can band together, blah, blah, blah. If it's discriminated against people who are, I don't know, 5'5" with brown hair, but you're not going to know that you are the basis on which you're being quote unquote discriminated against. You're not going to be able to find other people. I don't think it's going to be very hard to organize. So one question is, it's a pragmatic question. How the hell would those subgroups that are being harmed ever know that they're a part of that group? How would they find each other so that they could fight collectively? And the second thing is, you said that they should be allowed to ask for a change, and they already are allowed to. I think you can ask for whatever you want. Doesn't mean you're going to get it. And so I guess my question is, who has an obligation to actually satisfy that request? Is it and a moral obligation? I don't know about legal obligations, but who has a moral obligation to satisfy that request? Is it just as before? Is it those individual companies that are hiring? Is it the model providers, the SaaS providers, or whatever the model is? Is it their obligation? Yeah, that. Those are my two questions.
Yeah, great. So, on the first point, I think you're right that our discrimination framework is organized in the US around protected groups. People bring complaints on the basis of discrimination on race, gender, veteran status, age, these big seven
Sure.
categories that we generally understand to organize a lot of the discrimination that happens. And as you also suggested, there has been a movement inspired by work of Kimberly Crenshaw and other people to say, hey, we also need to look at some of the intersections of those
Sure.
categories. Maybe there's discrimination against Black women in particular, or older men in particular. And so we know how to audit for that type of discrimination. And those individuals in those groups might also know how to find each other and advocate for some kind of change. Now, I agree with you that if you're in some kind of novel algorithmic group where you have some collection of features that might be, let's say, one or more traditional categories of discrimination combined with some kind of particular algorithmic feature that isn't considered a category of discrimination, you might have no way of finding other people who are in that category.
Yeah.
And so that's why I don't think it's practical to think of this as a harm that should be addressed by individuals banding together with other similar
Okay.
individuals. I think they would have no way of finding each
Yeah.
other. Instead, I think this is something that some more centralized body should pursue an audit of at the level of the company or at the level of the algorithm provider.
Yeah, this is what you intimated at earlier with your talk of potential regulation. So this is what you're imagining is something like regulations that require of either the solution providers themselves or the people who are consuming the solutions, the companies, let's say Fortune 500 companies that are using HR software, to require some kind of diversity in algorithmic decision making. But then the question is like, okay, what does that even look like though? Is that plausible? Are they going to say you got to have 3 different models? You're going to have 7 different. It feels utterly arbitrary, but maybe that's just a reflection of my ignorance or something like that. What might such a regulation look like?
So, one option would be you can still have one model, but that model needs to reflect the uncertainty of your understanding of this decision space by offering some stochasticity in its predictions. So I'll give you an example of that. So let's say initially we said we are 100% sure that Reed is a good candidate, so we're going to offer him an interview every time. And we see Kathleen as the 51-49% candidate. And so, depending on the pool, let's say the pool is strong, she's going to end up dropping right below the threshold of 50%. And so, we're not going to offer her an interview every time we run this job search. Now, it might be that we are losing some information by being this deterministic. So, if there's a 70% candidate, maybe we should offer that candidate an interview 70% of the time, but not 100% of the time. And if there's a 51% candidate, maybe we should only offer that candidate an interview about half of the time, rather than just deterministically giving the 51% candidate an interview every time and the 49% candidate an interview none of the time. So it might be that companies would be themselves incentivized to do this because it would be better from an information theoretic point of view to learn more about these candidates across the spectrum and see a greater diversity of candidates. Or it could be that we should regulate something like that at the level of the software as a service provider and say large companies that are working with other large companies need to offer models that reflect the full range of their predictions and not just offer it to the same pool of top candidates every time.
I don't fully understand yet. I get it. So let's run through this example again. So you apply for this job at some company and you're given a score of 49 and the threshold is 50. So if you reached 50, you would have got an interview. In this case, you got a 49. I know that you talked about percentages earlier, but let's just put that to the side. And then if the search is run again and you apply again, then the system is meant to know that fact that you applied last time, that you were a 49, so you just missed it. But you're really like a 50. That means like you're essentially a 50-50 candidate. Whereas before it gave a red light for interviewing you. Now it gives you a green light. Do I have the picture right?
I think that would be one way of running it. I was thinking of something less deterministic. So I was imagining, let's say you're a college student who applies to 10 companies for a summer internship in finance. So you apply to JP Morgan Chase, Accenture, Fidelity, 7 more companies.
Sure. Yeah.
And it turns out that most of them use the same screening software.
Yep.
Now, that screening software could either give you a unique score at all of these, which in this case might be 49%, such that you don't get an interview at any of them.
Yep.
Or the screening software could allocate your score a little bit more randomly. So it could say, hey, this doesn't look like a great candidate, but maybe at 2 of the companies, we're going to roll the dice every time and we're going to give this candidate a an interview or recommend slot
Yeah.
at a few of the companies.
It feels to me not doable. The reason it feels not doable is that I don't think that there's that much, and maybe I'm wrong with this. I have to speak to more, say, HR people, but I don't think that there's that kind of, I don't know, coordination. I don't think that the company that's selling to those 7 companies, that they're comparing interview resumes from one company to another company. I don't even know if they collect that information. For all I know, that stays, as it were, within the walls of JP, and it stays within the walls of Citibank and within the walls of Accenture, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know that even that model provider has access to that information. And then I think about different departments doing hiring. Right? So it's not like the company does hiring. It's this department versus this department. And there's hundreds of departments all doing their own hiring. What you're talking about feels to me like it requires a level of coordination among the set of people who are hiring across time that is going to be just too big of a lift.
So I think that's the nice thing about randomization. So I agree with you. If we were trying to deterministically allocate to each of these companies who got an interview, it wouldn't work. But most of the third party providers assign applicants unique IDs.
Mm,
And as the applicants interact with their system, in a lot of these systems, there is a unique ID that follows candidates across all of their interactions with that third party provider.
mm,
But I agree with you, it wouldn't be practical to assign outcomes from the deterministic, centralized command and control perspective of the software provider. Instead, I think the software provider could, at each of these position level judgment tasks of trying to figure out which of this pool of applicants to recommend, could be and adding in some element of randomness or pseudo randomness.
mhm.
And by doing so, give opportunities to a broader range of
Yeah.
candidates.
I guess if we zoom out a little bit, really what we're looking for, what you're looking for, which I find plausible, is you're looking for some kind of regulatory requirement to introduce randomness or something along those lines into the process so that we don't get the kind of homogeneity that you're concerned with, the kind of homogeneity in which certain kinds of groups, whatever, however they're formed, whether they're the sort of typical big 7 or there are other weird ones, I don't know, people who went to community college. You want to avoid that homogeneity. And so some level of diversity or randomness has to be introduced to the system. And then I guess we could say maybe the regulation doesn't say exactly what might have recommendations about how you could introduce randomness, but I suppose really we don't have to get into those weeds in a way because there might be loads of ways that data scientists figure out about how to introduce randomness.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in a way, what we're trying to do is add back in this feature of human decision making that computer scientists often think of as a bad thing, which is that it is somewhat variable. So even
Mm,
if you ask highly trained professionals who their whole job is making decisions, so that could be judges, that could be doctors. These are people whose core part of their job is looking at a bunch of
yeah.
information, let's say a case or a medical file, and then making some kind of decision or judgment about it. If you ask these people to give their analysis and judgment on the same file with names changed
Yeah.
3 months later, about a third of the time they'll give a different
Mm,
answer. And so even the same person across time has some variability in their judgment.
right.
And certainly different people have very variable judgment. And when we think about that as computer scientists, we often say, oh, that's so bad. An algorithm would be so much better. And it might be that the algorithm's individual judgment is better in some cases. But this variability, it turns out, has a value in high uncertainty spaces like hiring.
Mm,
Hiring is a case where we actually rarely know who the best candidate
yeah.
is because there are so many different ways to be good at your job. And so introducing a level of sort of artificial certainty can have these sort of system level properties that aren't visible from the individual decision space.
So okay, so if I get this right, there's an interesting feature, especially in high stakes circumstances where we want consistent judgment. We don't want the judge. There's this famous, I think it's a totally debunked social experiment, but where the judges give different sentences based on whether they had a good night of sleep or whether they just had lunch or it's late in the day. This is supposed to have a big impact on what their judgments are. And even if that study is not exactly right, still there certainly is variance. And then the thought is that's super unjust because what you want is people treated the same across situations, across time. It's not fair that I got a more harsh sentence because the judge was tired or something along those lines. Or that person got a less harsh sentence than I did, or they got an interview, or they got a mortgage, and I didn't. And apparently, there's no real difference between us. So this inconsistency, mm, I don't know if it constitutes might be too strong of a word, but highly indicates that I've been treated unfairly or unjustly. And so we want consistency. Data scientists go, hey, guess what? Consistency is my thing. I can make this system make the same kind of decision given the same inputs every single time. And so, hooray, data science, we got more justice now. And then your point is, I think you're saying to them, they are right that at that individual level, that kind of variance that we think is unjust, that will go away. That can go away. But then what we get is this other form of injustice, which is these groups of people getting, I'm not sure if discriminated against is the right word. I don't mean that in a legal sense, but something like discriminated against. And so you really and that's because there are these weird subgroups that might pop up that consistently get denied mortgage, get denied a lighter sentence, get denied, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're trading one injustice for another injustice. And then the answer to that is, I think it though, progress has been made actually, but there's one more step for moral progress, which is now to introduce, I don't know, now you want to introduce randomization, but that pulls us back to the intuition that it's unjust when judges give different sentences to different people, even though their circumstances seem to be otherwise identical.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of putting it. And one thing that I would add is there's the kind of principle that you're referring to. Sometimes in the law, people call it treating like cases alike. If you and I have similar features, we should get a similar outcome. Now, it could be that we want consistency in the sense that I am identical to myself. And so every time I occur in the system, I should get the same outcome. But it could also be that there's an existing set of mistakes, which is that this system, although it's pretty good overall, is making a mistake on some small group of people or some individual where they haven't identified that this person does have features that are alike to some other person.
Mhm.
And so, what I want to avoid is the new consistency of these mistakes, whatever they are.
So let me make sure that I understand this. The intuition that we want people treated the same, they should be treated the same even though they're different, is this thought that we should treat like cases alike. That's essentially a kind of moral principle. And you're not, are you pushing against that view? Do you affirm that principle, or do you think actually that gets us into too much trouble and we should amend that principle to something else?
I think that principle is correct in very specific cases, such as the criminal justice system,
Mhm.
where we have a defined set of criteria that are the only set of criteria by which we're supposed to be judging people. If we've clearly defined what a law is and what constitutes breaking that law, then if two people are alike and having performed the same actions, they should get the same sentence for the most part. I think we are sometimes wrong in exporting that principle to cases where we have a much lower degree of certainty,
Mm.
like predictions about the future. So, criminal sentences are typically analyses of the past. Something happened in the past. We're trying to figure out what it is exactly and then how to evaluate it. Whereas when we're trying to predict the future, will someone be a good employee? Will they return their loan in a timely way? We're making a prediction about something that's fundamentally unknowable. And so I think in those cases, we should be a little bit less certain that we're getting it right every single time. And therefore, the idea that the only way to be just towards people is to treat them alike in virtue of the aspects of the situation that we currently understand might not be the full picture. And so maybe there's a sense of epistemic humility in saying, actually, we do have a lot of uncertainty about some of these prediction problems. And so we want to give people some opportunity across this entire space of decisions to tell us if we were wrong.
So let me put this slightly differently. Tell me if I got this right. The idea is, yeah, treat like cases alike on the condition that you really know enough to know that these cases are like. Or just say, yes, treat like cases like. But in a lot of decision making, we don't even know enough information to know if these are like cases. So, like in the hiring case, we don't know if these are like cases because there's so many qualities that go into making someone a good or a bad employee or to increase or decrease the probability that they're going to be successful that we don't even know. We shouldn't apply the principle treat like cases alike because we don't know enough to know whether these candidates are sufficiently like.
Yeah, I agree with that. We might have a prediction, but we should have pretty low confidence in our prediction a lot of the time. And
Bad
that
at
in
we're
some
bad at
of
that.
the we're really bad
Yeah.
at it. And in hiring, oftentimes we're saved by the fact that there are so many good candidates. And so we can be pretty bad at it and still end up with a reasonable
Mm.
pool. But it's not because we're so good at predicting who's going to be good.
There's just a wide margin. There's room for a wide margin of error in those kinds of cases. And then I know that with hiring in particular, we're also just bad at we don't even know whether the hiring decisions are any good because we don't do any tracking of they've been hired and now we're going to see whether they succeed or fail. And then if they do fail, told you if they do succeed, did they succeed for the reasons that they were hired or did they succeed for reasons that we weren't even aware of? It's a bit of a mess. Can you give me some other kinds of areas other than HR? Like, how does this apply in the mortgage case or something along those lines or a loan case? Yeah, what are some other examples? Because the hiring one is paradigmatic. I take it that your complaint philosophical in the sense of philosophical complaint is that this is going to happen across the board. This is going to happen all over the place. So we've been harping or focusing on hiring a lot, but I take it your point is that insofar as the world is getting increasingly algorithmically modified, the problem scales. So can you maybe say a little bit about how this marches outside the walls of say HR and how else you see
Yeah,
this affecting us?
absolutely. So I think there are two areas to look for additional similar concerns. So we can think of this in general as concerns with some kind of algorithmic monoculture. So there's the same or a very similar algorithm across the entire space. And then the moral concern is that it's homogenized the outcome and given people the same outcome every time. So a few areas to look for this would be other kinds of opportunities. So, as you mentioned, that could be lending. Lending is a little bit tricky because, in some sense, we already have an algorithmic monoculture even before the new fancy algorithms, which is your credit score. And people have written about the ways in which mistakes in credit scoring can act as a bottleneck to a lot of different opportunities, where just in virtue of having a bad credit score, or especially when that's unfairly assigned, you might have trouble getting a loan, but also a job and also apartment. So that is maybe a socially consequential familiar example. But we could also think about a second domain, which is the provision of services. So the same voices often have trouble being recognized across a few different platforms. So if you have Google's voice recognition software, Amazon's voice recognition software, other major providers of voice recognition software that might work with a bunch of different companies on the back end, there are some voices that just are less recognized than others. And this has very much a traditional bias angle, but it's more specific than that, in that even if on average, voices from people in this group, let's say people with certain kinds of accents, are less recognized, there can also be huge variance within that group. So a particular individual might have trouble getting their voice recognized anywhere. And you can also think about some cases where you might value a diversity of algorithms because it gives you some kind of information as a decision maker yourself. So people often value the opportunity to get a second opinion in a medical case before making some kind of big decision like whether to
Mm.
have a surgery. But if multiple doctors are all relying on the same algorithm, it might be that you're not getting any new information by getting this second opinion.
Right. So that's a case in which we want to see whether there's disagreement. We want to see, like I did this when I needed to get surgery. One doctor recommended that this was like ACL replacement. So one doctor recommended that I use a cadaver's ACL. One person said, no, use a piece of your quad, turn that into an ACL. And I wanted the disagreement, and I wanted to know why they disagreed so that I could try to make the best decision. So I take it that your point is something like we often seek out opposing, or at least if we're being really epistemically responsible with respect to how we form our beliefs, we're going to seek out differing opinions so that we can weigh the evidence and then come to what we think is the best conclusion. And I take it your point is that to the extent that the single model gets used across the board, you're tamping down on that ability to get different perspectives on the problem, different potential solutions. And so we can't get rational disagreement, and then we can't get weighing of evidence. We just get this sort of foolish consistency.
Yeah, that's a great example. So by going to see the second opinion person, if you were a good Bayesian who's doing some kind of updating process where you're evaluating the extent to which you should believe the initial doctor's opinion to use the cadaver, then you see the second doctor has a different opinion. You now have slightly less credence in the idea that it must be the cadaver. You now think
Yeah.
maybe it's 50-50.
Right.
It could be the cadaver or it could be my quad. And so now I have to gather more evidence in order to decide.
Yeah.
If you didn't know that behind the scenes, both of the doctors who are giving you the same opinion were actually relying on the same algorithm, you would be wrongly double counting that evidence. And so you would miss the opportunity to correctly set your beliefs at 50-50, and instead you would give double weight to this one algorithmic recommendation.
Oh, that's weird. Why would the algorithm give me different recommendations?
Oh, sorry. I was saying the algorithm would give you the same recommend if these two doctors that you went to actually gave the same recommendation.
Oh, I see it.
Uh,
Yes, yes, yes. You think, oh, I see. Right. Sorry. Yes, yes, yes. If they gave me the same one, and I think, oh, that's two doctors that confirmed it, but they're both relying on the exactly same algorithm. I haven't actually gotten a legit second opinion. I've just gotten a reiteration of the first one without knowing it. Oh, that's cool. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe if this opinion from the algorithm we can just posit is better, maybe it's a better overall opinion, it's more likely to be true. But as long as it's the case that it's not 100% likely to be the best recommendation, there might still be some value in knowing what's the spread of different opinions and
Yeah.
how can I use that to make a better judgment.
Are these conversations or these cases in which the 49% versus 51%, and so we've got to introduce randomness or something along those lines? And same with all the kinds of decision making that you're talking about now. Are we just talking about edge cases? Are we just talking about those 50-50 cases? So the person who's a freaking awesome candidate, I take it that we don't want to introduce randomness when this person is like 99%, they're an awesome employee. We don't want them randomized out of the group. So is the real problem just at the edge cases? And if so, does that make it a smaller problem?
Yeah, so I would say two things to that. One is we actually don't know whether it's a problem at the edge cases in the sense that we often, in these decisions, don't have any independent access to information that the model isn't collecting. And so it might be that this person appears to be a 49% candidate from the perspective of the information we
Mhm.
have. But if we have different information, they might appear to be a 99%
Yeah.
candidate, and we just don't know. But to answer the other part of your question, what should we do about cases where, let's say, we're just right that this is a great candidate? If we, by introducing some randomness, we make it less likely that this person does get the opportunity, is that too big of a cost? I think we could approach that in different ways in some of these different decision making scenarios. In a paper with co authors about randomization, one of the things we suggest is that there are different randomization strategies.
Yeah.
You could say, I'm going to go really hardcore. I'm going to randomize the entire spectrum. And so the 99% candidate is going to get it 99, but not 100% of the time. But that also means the 1% candidate will get it 1% of the time.
Hmm.
Or if I don't have that same taste for randomness, if I'm expressing the concern that you're reasonably expressing, which is, hey, there's some people who just look really good and some people look really bad,
Yeah.
then I could say, I'm only going to randomize in that bracket right around the decision threshold,
Yeah.
let's say 40 to 60.
Yeah.
And those are the people that I'm most uncertain about.
Yeah.
We could also do that in a fancier way by using something like conformal prediction to say, instead of just analyzing that bracket, let's ask the model which points it's most uncertain about and randomize those.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that. Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. I suppose this is my last question. I get that regulation looks like the appropriate mechanism here. Is there any, and the reason it's the appropriate mechanism is that it seems to be a collective action problem. And the best way to solve collective action problems is by some collective making the decision. The best collective we've got going is government. Not generally a fan of slogans, but government is the word that we use for the things that we choose to do together. I always thought that was a catchy slogan for government. Is there anything that companies should want to do right now before? Yeah, look, the regulations, maybe it's going to happen, maybe it's not. Even if we do get AI regulations, who knows what they're going to look like? They're probably not going to include this point, at least in the near future. So is there something that companies ought to do now, or government using AI for that matter? Government uses AI and is trying to use AI in all sorts of cases in the VA and distribution of goods and resources, et cetera, et cetera. So is there something that organizations should do now in order to, I don't know, either A, decrease injustice, or B, actually help themselves? Or is it, no, there's not really a point in doing anything unless it's done collectively?
Yeah, I think even though maybe it's not a competitive disadvantage, I think there is an incentive to companies to better act on the uncertainty that they already know that they have and learn more about candidates. So it might be that there's a slightly higher cost in the short term as you hire a broader range of candidates, but you actually, by randomizing your predictions a little bit, learn more about the types of candidates that are out there. And
Hmm.
so in the medium term, you end up hiring better people. And I think you could say a similar thing for lending,
Hmm.
maybe by intentionally picking some candidates who you feel like you don't know as much about, your predictions are more uncertain about, and giving loans to them, you might learn about those types of candidates. So I think for companies that are pursuing some kind of long term strategy where they're trying to improve over time, this could be a really impactful course of action to pursue.
So again, they are inadvertently shutting themselves off from good candidates for loans, good candidates for a job, et cetera. And if they introduce some degree of randomness, does that, and it could be bracketed in the way that you articulated, like between the 40 and 60 or whatever, they might see themselves on opportunities that they're otherwise squandering.
Similarly, in a hospital setting, there's often a search for the one best algorithm that will become the standard of care. But doctors, as we all know and love them, sometimes don't like being told what to do. And they often ignore algorithmic
Yeah.
recommendations, even in the rare scenarios where they are proven to be better than the doctor's own judgment. And so it could even be that by having multiple algorithms that provide this team of experts to advise, the doctor might be more willing to act on this sort of consensus view that offers some sense of what's the uncertainty here rather than just one single, oh, you should do
That,
this, which they might
that's a
ignore.
great metaphor. That using multiple models is akin to having a team of experts, where experts can disagree with each other, but they're all expert. They're communicating something of value that ought to be considered by the, in this case, the doctor, could be a judge, whoever the end user is. Yeah, super interesting. Kathleen, thank you so much. This has been super interesting. I get worked up about these collective action problems. A lot of times I think in AI, we get worked up about individual person wronged. And I think what people are not paying enough attention to is not what happens when this person or that person uses AI, but what happens when the set of AI is used. We're going to wind up with the analogy here, I think, is climate change issues. And it's cool and interesting and important to think about what's the analog to climate change when we talk about widespread use of AI. So, anyway, thanks again. This has been really fascinating.
Yeah, that's such a nice way to put it. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this with you, and thanks for the great
Yeah,
discussion.
my pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So, first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design a podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.